everybody, and welcome to this session of the Oxford Real Farming Conference. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, here today. I've spent this morning taking part in another virtual conference of an organisation called Feed in Bristol, which covers the area that I represent in the southwest of England. And that was bringing together all the people who are absolutely passionate about tackling food poverty and ensuring a healthy, sustainable food supply for the city. And of course, we reflected on 2020 and the superb effort that the city made to feed people during the pandemic. So it's good now to go from that very local discussion about food, sustainable food, to the global by hearing what Michael has to say today. Michael was appointed by the Human Rights Council to the role of Special Rapporteur last March, and he took up his post in May. He's a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, and he's taught and lectured on the right to food, human rights and development issues at a long list of prestigious academic institutions. I was also interested to read about his work with peasant organisations, labour unions and human rights activists. In yesterday's Guardian, for those of you who've seen it, we had yet another story about human rights abuses in our global food supply chains, with reports that in Brazil, workers on beef farms and in slaughterhouses were kept in conditions similar to slavery. So I think it's important when we talk about the right to food, it shouldn't only ever just be about what is consumed, but how that food is produced too. I was pleased too to see that in Michael's first report to the General Assembly, he raised the lack of focus on human rights, including the right to food, in trade policy. And that's something that is very topical now in the UK as we look to a post-Brexit future. The UK should be leading the way on ensuring that social and environmental concerns are at the heart of trade policy. As chair of the all-party parliamentary group on agroecology, I can assure people listening in today that we will continue to press for this in the UK Parliament and for a nature-friendly, sustainable approach to farming. Low-carbon farming practices, agroforestry, reduction of food waste and lower carbon, healthier diets are all things that we should be embracing to ensure our food systems are more accessible, sustainable and healthy. If we work to ensure our crops and soil are healthy, our land is being used sustainably and food is not being unnecessarily wasted, we can make huge progress towards guaranteeing the right to food for all. It is unthinkable that so many in both developed and developing countries continue to go hungry in 2021. And I'm sure we wish Michael all the best in his endeavours. But that is enough for me. So now, without further ado, over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Carrie. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I have to say, to have Carrie as the chair of today's session, as the moderator, it's really exciting because Carrie, I think, represents, unfortunately, the rare politician who understands the issues, who appreciates agriculture in relationship to broader systemic issues like climate change, poverty, inequality. And I think someone like Carrie is a good model for politicians all over the world. And I also want to thank the organizers of this conference. This is probably the largest international conference on agroecology that I think anyone has seen or attended. And it also is a model for the future. And I hope it's a model for the future. This is a conference that has brought people from all over the world in a shared commitment to living in good relations with the land, water, and with each other. There has been a struggle over the world's food systems in a real sustained way for at least the past 25 years, and there have been victories. Food is now central to all political agendas. There's an increasing recognition that we cannot tackle climate change without changing food systems. The current trading system in agriculture is no longer touted as an ideal, even by the most ardent fans of the WTO. And there's a growing consensus, even amongst businesses, that food supply chains are too long. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, I act as an independent expert. I'm authorized by the UN to monitor and report on what's going on in the world in terms of food, hunger, malnutrition, agriculture, and the state of the world's political economy in relation to those issues. I meet with people from social movements, unions, advocacy groups, government, and businesses. So a big part of my job is listening and learning about what's going on. As Carrie pointed out, I started my mandate in May, and it was at the outset of COVID-19, the pandemic. And what I have noticed is that this is a virus that is fed upon the inequalities of our society. Those with the most power have actually profited from the pandemic, and those who are marginalized have been hit the hardest. Even with a vaccine, there are some difficult times that lie ahead. My plan today is to share what I've learned so far in my work as Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And I'll talk about three things. First, I'll share what I've learned from the pandemic itself. Second, I'll talk about what's going on at the United Nations. And third, I'll conclude with what you can do to change your food system. I'm putting out some ideas out there really in the spirit of opening up a conversation today. So let me start with COVID-19. And the thing to really, I think everyone already appreciates, especially everyone here today, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has not only been a public health crisis, but it has also generated a global hunger crisis. Even before the pandemic, things were bad. The number of people who were hungry was increasing, and it wasn't because of the lack of food. Roughly speaking, the world has produced more than enough food per capita for several decades. The issue has been that power in the food system continues to be concentrated in the hands of a few companies, a wealthy class of people, and a small number of powerful countries. And the pandemic has only made matters worse. What is shameful about hunger is that it is almost always avoidable. Hunger and famine are caused by political failure, not because by an objective lack of supply or a natural disaster. People go hungry usually for two reasons. Sometimes it is because those with power control the supply of food and are withholding food on purpose as a cynical tactic to maintain or enhance their power. We see this with economic embargoes and blockades today. Alternatively, people go hungry because public and private institutions are undemocratic and unresponsive to people's demands. Instead, they are designed to control populations by concentrating power and preserving order. And the example Carrie mentioned in Brazil is a great example of this. And usually it's a combination of both scenarios. In effect, food shortages all over the world are usually the result of what Professor Susan Marks has called planned misery. You can predict the misery, you can predict the famine, you can predict the hunger. Right now, there is still no internationally coordinated action responding to the hunger crisis caused by the pandemic. I'm still trying to understand why there has been no global coordination on this by the world's governments. My instinct is to first ask who is benefiting from the crisis and understand their power in the food system. The natural place to address this issue within the United Nations system is before the Committee on World Food Security, also known as the CFS. This is a committee in which civil society has a very powerful voice. Peasant movements, unions, women and youth groups are able to organize collectively and autonomously and ensure that their perspective is taken seriously by the world's governments. But what I'm seeing is powerful governments avoiding the COVID-19 question at the UN because they don't want to work multilaterally. Powerful countries may not like each other, but one thing they do agree upon is they don't like working multilaterally. Even in the midst of a global pandemic, powerful countries are arrogant enough to think that they can tackle this global crisis without compromising and working with others. So how do we understand this crisis? Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, all governments are trying to balance between health and wealth. If they attend to people's health by locking everything down, they bring the economy to a halt and destroy people's livelihoods. But if they prioritize the economy and emphasize economic production and growth, then a large number of people will continue to get sick, weak, or die. A common way to frame the issue has been in terms of trade-offs. As infection rates decrease, governments can open the economy more. But when the pandemic worsens, governments impose safety measures that may slow down economic productivity. Some politicians were openly willing to let the elderly die to save the economy. This is not the sentiment of one or two politicians. the death toll in vulnerable communities like the elderly continues to rise, even though COVID-19 preventative measures are well known. This indicates an increasing willingness to sacrifice segments of society, such as workers, migrants, people with disabilities, women, children, indigenous peoples, to sacrifice all these people in order to maintain economic productivity. The problem is not just political mismanagement. Thinking in terms of trade-offs has analytical limitations. It pits health versus livelihoods. It assumes that by focusing more on people's health, inevitably there will be an economic cost, and vice versa. This way of thinking has been reactive and has not tackled the inherent inequities that are making the pandemic's effects brutal and prolonged. In order to develop a systemic response, it is important to understand the pandemic as a crisis of care. This framework provides a way of identifying priorities and tackling the pandemic's effects systemically. Thinking in terms of trade-offs, however, frames things as different compromises and sacrifices, whereas thinking in terms of care frames the issue as a matter of sequencing. It gets us asking who should be protected first in order to make everyone else better and stronger. Because people are getting sick and dying during the pandemic, people, and mostly women, are having to work harder and longer to ensure that we all stay healthy and alive. Centering care work aligns with the human rights approach because for too long and in too many places, those people who take care of others are often the most marginalized and undervalued. States have deployed a range of measures to tackle the pandemic's challenges, but there remains a lack of attention given to both paid and unpaid care work. This has amplified the impact of the pandemic and perpetuated the cycle of inequality, with women bearing the brunt of the impact and economic shock. Care is not just about attending directly to people's emotional and physical needs. It includes all activities that nourish and nurture, all the elements that are necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life. Understood in this way, care captures a number of elements: the need of individuals in vulnerable situations. It also captures the aspect of social capacity to care through institutions. And it's about the needs of people who are care workers and are essential for humanity's well-being. If anything, people will hopefully continue to push their governments to be a government of caregivers and supporters of care workers, instead of a government of actuarial and analysts evaluating the price of human life against profit margins. And of course, food is at the heart of care work. So that's just an introduction to how I've been thinking and what I've been learning from others, from feminist thinkers, from activists, on how to think about the pandemic in a way to get us through this. Now I want to turn to what's going on at the United Nations. As I mentioned before, even before the pandemic, global hunger was on the rise. Last year, in fall 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago, the United Nations Secretary General António Guterres announced that he would convene a UN Food Systems Summit in the fall of 2021. And it's scheduled to happen. From the outset, the summit was problematic. First, the blueprint for the summit essentially came from the World Economic Forum in Davos. Guterres appointed Dr. Agnes Kalibata as his special envoy to lead the preparation for the summit. Dr. Kalibata is the former president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa and has been a proponent of high-tech, high-cost agriculture. Moreover, much of the early summit organizing has been underwritten by mega philanthropic organizations committed to market-based solutions. These are organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. In response to all these very pro-market, pro-high-tech perspectives that were defining the agenda of the summit, over 500 farmer-led social movements, food worker unions, and human rights activists cried out against the UN Secretary General Summit and expressed their concern that all of this reflected an attempt by the private sector, by businesses, to take over global food politics. I've been closely monitoring how the summit has been coming along for the past year or so. It's scheduled to take place in New York this coming fall, with a pre-summit in late June. The specific dates have not been finalized yet. Because of some serious advocacy for the past year, I'm finally seeing some reference to human rights in the summit preparation. In the beginning, human rights was nowhere to be seen, but now I'm seeing it a bit more here and there, but it remains in the margins of the summit preparation. The other thing I am seeing is there is no space being given to agroecology, as if agroecology is not a broad-based popular movement that is increasing in attention all over the world. What I am seeing is that the summit, the dominant framework informing the summit and the analysis around the summit is about market-based solutions, which is an old way of thinking, and it's what got us to the problems of today. There is an emphasis on sustainable practice, but it's really about reforming the existing system of intensive agriculture and less about actually transforming things. So what do we do about this summit? Millions of people from around the world, from some of the world's most marginalized communities, from the world's communities that feed us and keep us alive, they've decided to unite and protest against the direction that the summit is taking. This call came from a group of an organization known as the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, also known as the CSM. If you search the internet for CSM Food Systems Summit Open Call, you can find more information and join that movement of protest. Also, a number of organizations are participating in the summit through the summit. And the summit has what are called action tracks. It has 5 action tracks, which are the mechanisms of how work is getting done in the summit, especially in the lead up and the preparation. The 5 action tracks are these themes: access, production, consumption, equitable livelihoods, and the 5th track is climate resilience. Each action track is hosting open public dialogues, and different countries are also hosting national food dialogues. Some of you here today may want to participate in these dialogues and make sure that a strong voice is present at the summit advocating for human rights and agroecology. I don't think you would be able to necessarily change the entire direction of the summit, but you can at least neutralize some of the greenwashing that can happen at these types of events and make sure that nobody can ignore human rights. The mass mobilization from out with the summit has already made a difference. It has already challenged the summit's legitimacy, and it has forced the organizers to adapt and take human rights seriously. And the challenges from within are also forcing the summit organizers to address the power of agroecology and human rights as social movements. My role as Special Rapporteur is in between these dynamics. I regularly meet with the summit organizers, pushing them to do better on human rights, and I meet regularly with civil society in order to listen to their demands, to make sure that they're being heard in the halls of power. In the end, I will judge the summit in a report to the UN General Assembly. I won't be measuring the summit in terms of success or failure as such. To me, what's most important is whether social movements, unions, and advocacy groups come out stronger from this whole process, all while we're living in the midst of a pandemic. Which leads me to my final point today. What you can do to change your food system. Well, first off, you're already doing it. You're here. You're attending events like these, learning from others, reflecting on what you can do in your community, and sharing your knowledge and experience. This is not easy. Showing up is not easy. Events like these provide the infrastructure for broad-based change. It creates community. What's hard in this particular format is that it's difficult to meet people and develop new relationships. To me, that's how change happens, by changing existing relationships and fostering new ones, by deepening or maybe reviving old friendships and making new ones. And I can say I've already made new friends with Ruth and Francesca, and all the other organizers have been incredible in the lead up to this. And I hope they consider me also a friend of this conference. At the heart of agroecology, what has driven the food sovereignty movement, what has made the right to food a radical tool, has been solidarity. What I think lies ahead for all of us in the next 2 years is to really re-energize and re-articulate what solidarity means to people today. I'll conclude with sharing a story from my own country, from Lebanon, and then with some specific ideas about solidarity. To me, what's going on in Lebanon can teach others what's at stake and the importance of being fearless. Lebanon is unique in many ways, but it also serves as a warning to all countries and potentially a model. It has highlighted what things can look like for any country when everything goes wrong. When the international economic system is negligent, when national politicians are cynical and callous, and when local institutions are gutted. Because of the pandemic, and before the pandemic, I have no doubt everyone can imagine their own governments in those terms. Lebanon provides an account of how the right to food can be a tool, even if it is not enacted in a law, a national law as such. I think campaigns to enact a right to food in national law, like the one in Scotland, can be very powerful. Nourish Scotland is a fantastic organization. The Scottish government has been receptive to the right to food, and I think the Scottish Right to Food campaign is an inspiration for everybody all over the world. But I'll focus on 4 things that Lebanon has taught me. 1, even in the darkest moments, people can find strength in their inherent dignity. 2, when national governments fail, political leadership can still be found in all other types of public institutions and subnational governments. 3, agroecology and food sovereignty still don't have an answer to how to build a fair trade regime. And 4, before anything is possible, we must have strong social movements that regularly re-energize and re-examine what solidarity means. On the first point of dignity, let me start with a story, and it's a grim story. On July 3rd, 2020, a man in the main streets of Beirut, during the morning hustle, shot himself and left behind a Lebanese flag on his chest. The flag covered a copy of his clean judicial and criminal record, and with it came a note that read, "I am not a heretic." The note was a reference to a very popular song which begins, "I am not a heretic, but hunger is a heretic, illness is a heretic, poverty is a heretic, and humiliation is a heretic." Ali al-Haq's note meant that when he was an innocent man whose suicide was not a sin. His note also meant that he was not a martyr for a cause. He was a person facing the indignity and subjugation of hunger. Al-Haq reminds us that when an individual is overcome by formidable forces, they still retain control over their inherent dignity. Asserting our dignity in everyday life is the ultimate form of resistance against oppression. By claiming his dignity, Al-Haq asserted his authority as a human being, indicting the government for pushing almost everyone in the country into hunger, pain, and death. That afternoon, people gathered to that spot on Hamra Street in Beirut to mourn and protest. Their anger was directed at the triad of oligarchs, the central bank, the private banking sector, and the politicians who were all responsible for Lebanon's financial crisis and mismanagement of the pandemic. A woman carried a sign that read, "This was not a suicide, this was murder in cold blood," capturing popular sentiment around the death. When the same woman was interviewed on TV, she said, "Where are the authorities now? We can't pay for food, People are starving. They are dying. Where are they? Soon after this death, on August 4th, the port of Beirut blast destroyed lives and livelihoods, plunging the entire country further into despair. It exposed a core weakness of Lebanon's food system. Before the explosion, 85% of Lebanon's food was imported, and one port handled almost 70% of that food. Like many countries, Lebanon was dependent on international food markets. Lebanon's hunger crisis was not the result of an accident. It was the result of cold financial calculation. Whether it was the IMF or World Bank underwriting debt plans for the country, or whether it was national leaders attempting to sell national assets to foreign interests under the guise of foreign investment, nobody's plan addressed the long-standing fragility of the country's food system. Just like for decades now, almost no government in the world has addressed their own food system's fragility. And I'm not sure this particular UN Food Systems Summit is going to come up with an adequate international food plan. Which takes me now out from Lebanon into some ideas for the way forward. Thinking about public institutions and thinking about rooting the right to food in a concept of human dignity, it opens up political possibilities. It's important to think of the right to food in terms of dignity and not in narrow terms as a mechanism to petition a judge. That's how it can open up political space. Any public institution, any level of government can take up the right to food. I'll give you one example, and I'll focus on Brazil, but there are other examples. Ghana is another great example. In Brazil, in the early 2000s, the national government assisted agricultural collectives by mandating state schools, government schools, public schools, to purchase a substantial percentage of food for school meals from local family and indigenous farmers. Then they combined this with universal meals for all school children. All school children in Brazil, regardless of their background, got a free school meal. When the government combined these two dynamics, they significantly reduced hunger in Brazil and empowered those people that take care of our children, the teachers and the farmers and indigenous people. The lesson from Brazil and from COVID-19 is that schools are not just institutions of learning, they are institutions of care. We can extrapolate from Brazil and the current pandemic and learn that about the importance of focusing on all institutions of care, schools, universities, hospitals, and nursing homes, and their relationship to food producers. Any governing body that regulates these institutions can take up the right to food as part of their mandate and establish long-lasting relationships with food producers committed to agroecological practices and fair labor practices. In sum, a right to food approach emphasizes nourishment, not just subsistence. Food should be something that makes people stronger physically, but also politically and culturally. I'll leave trade aside for now. I'm eager to get to questions, but I will reference that I've written my first report, as Carrie noted, was about trade and the importance of trade. I've presented my ideas before the WTO, and what I'm happy to report is that after 25 years, the WTO is at a point now where I think radical change is possible. And I think trade needs to be on the agenda in a more sustained way when it comes to food politics. It's been a long-standing issue, but I think this is the time where change can really happen. I just hope that it would be changed for the better, that it would be a trade regime, and again, I presented these ideas in my first report, a trade regime that is actually based on agroecological principles and human rights. My final point is on solidarity. Any hope in Lebanon or any country, really, will come from people's ability to come together and form independent unions and cooperatives. It will also come from worker and farm solidarity internationally of helping each other, people-to-people networks, helping each other. For the food movement more broadly, there is much work to be done within agroecological movements and across different food movements. And I'll just end with some bullet points. First, because of the pandemic, most people are tired and sick. It's just hard to keep things going. and we shouldn't underestimate how much more work it takes just to survive these days. Mutual aid networks are springing up everywhere. Sometimes we take care of others and people take care of us. That's my only point there, is just make sure you take care of each other and we take care of our neighbors, we take care of ourselves. That's real work, and I think that's everyone's priority, and to be graceful and generous with each other in these moments. Second, trade unions have supported agroecological principles, but much more work needs to be done to better clarify the relationship between farmers and workers. Now, obviously, sometimes farmers leave their farms or are pushed off their land and become workers, but generally speaking, especially since agroecology is labor intensive, I think it's important for clarifying the relationship between agroecological farmers, who are employers, and workers, especially migrant workers. Third, sometimes people will focus on the importance of family farms, but families can easily be spaces of oppression and patriarchy. Let's not lose focus on that. Fourth, because of the Food Systems Summit, many in the climate change community are now paying attention to food for the first time, or they're just developing their ideas about food for the first time. This is an opportunity to reach out and build new and stronger ties between climate change activists and food activists. Even though there is a lot in common, the differences between these two movements cannot be underestimated, and that solidarity work will take time and effort. And finally, I consider this conference today to be a model for the future. Even though agroecology prioritizes local contexts, we all know that the local is always shaped by international forces, for better or for worse. In fact, the strength of the agroecology movement has been built on international relationships and international exchanges of knowledge. As times get harder, I know many people look more inward. Nationalism and racism are on the rise. I see this where I live. In Oregon, in the United States, for example, people might very well be committed to regenerative agricultural practices and local social justice causes, but might still be racist in their outlook towards migrant labor, or parochial in their worldview, or oppressive within their own families. Let us continue to meet like this today and strengthen our international solidarity. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Michael. There was so much that was thought-provoking and huge scope in terms of the number of issues that you raised. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. And the first question that I've been given, you mentioned that at the UN summit, you were concerned that the dominant frame of analysis was market-based solutions. And I've been asked to put to you the question, what is the alternative model to market economics that the summit should be addressing? And also as part of that, how does the summit connect to COP26?
Yes. Thank you. So on what I refer to as market-based solutions. So what I meant by that is, of course we need markets. We need to buy and sell things. Markets are part of everyday life. But up until for the last, I would say, since at least the early 80s, the idea has been about institutions, laws, and policies have been geared more towards making sure markets are stable in a way that's serving profit. So what's been happening is the way the WTO was designed and many other institutions has been about serving the market, making sure that whether it's the financial market or whatever is running smoothly. But there are other ways of understanding markets, which is markets should serve people. The line being people over profit. And so there are ideas of how to regulate markets, how to make sure markets are embedded in already existing social networks of trust, the importance of informal markets. Most people in the world get their food through informal markets. Informal markets are not illegal. Informal markets means they're not maybe necessarily registered with the government in the correct ways, but they're still legal to operate. Those are important. Governments can support informal markets. Governments can make sure markets are fair. That idea of fairness and equity has been lost, and there's ways of thinking about that. Now, the Food Systems Summit relationship with COP is an open question. From the summit organizers, what I see is, they are reaching out. I don't have close contact with the COP organizers, but what I do see is from the ground is organizers are working together slowly. So I think I know I've been hearing from people in Glasgow and the UK, because that's where it's being hosted. Food's on the activist agenda and on people's agenda here today, obviously. So I think it will have to come from the ground up. I think that the stronger the social movements are about putting that on the agenda of both COP and the Food Systems Summit, they can bring those summits together. But right now, it's disjointed, it seems.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done before Glasgow this year to actually establish the themes and pull everything together. And obviously COVID has knocked everything off course. The next question is from Patrick Mulvaney. It says, you highlight the importance of the UN Committee on World Food Security. How do you think the driving force of social movement through the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism can ensure adoption of strong agroecology recommendations embedded in the food security framework?
Sorry, Kate, can you were going in and out.
Yeah, I was a bit fast. So you highlight the importance of the UN Committee on World Food Security. And then the question is, how do you think the driving force of social movements through the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism can ensure adoption of strong agroecology recommendations embedded in the food sovereignty framework?
Right. So currently what's going on at the Committee on World Food Security at the CFS is they're negotiating sort of broad-based principles over agroecology. And there's a divide between countries that support agroecology and other countries which are suspicious of agroecology and frame it as anti-technology. And I think that's framing is in bad faith, to be honest. And so I'm just starting with the country perspective, and then I'll switch to sort of what movements and indigenous people can do. Some countries, and this is mostly European countries, sort of want to have best of both worlds. They want to have agroecology, but they want to have capital-intensive, high finance style technology as well. And they're trying to play both sides. I think what the social movements have done a very good job is highlighting first that agroecology clearly serves human rights. It clearly, because it treats the question of justice as an issue that needs to inform decision-making from the beginning, it clarified that if you are in favor of human rights, therefore you must take agroecology seriously. You must actually adopt agroecology. Anything else, then it raises the question, well, what's, existing technologies, what they call sustainable intensive agriculture, this is most likely going to harm people's rights. It's going to create more inequity. It puts the burden on others to justify it. So the social movements have done that to shift the debate, to put the onus on those that are against agroecology to explain themselves in terms of equity. So they've done a great job in that regard. Now, what's missing is some sort of mixture or an alliance between social movements and governments that want to promote agroecology on a national basis. And there are governments that are starting to do that more and more. Examples are Senegal, Mexico, I suspect Bolivia after the recent elections. Now, there's good relationships between the social movements and those governments, but I'm wondering if there could be that deeper tie between a strategic relationship between social movements and governments to create the political energy to start adopting on that national scale. And so I'm hoping to visit Senegal. I put out an invitation, and other countries that are trying to think of agroecology on a national scale, and to learn from countries like that, to see what they're doing and try and share that information with everyone. The other, I should add, the FAO does support agroecology. There are resources within the FAO that movements and governments can draw from in terms of knowledge, expertise, and financial support, really. So the parts are there, and it's now, I think the energy is about coordination and organization.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So the next question from BJ says, can the WTO and FAO deal with protectionism dumping and tariffs, which negatively affect the developing world? These are all such huge questions. I'm sure you could give whole lectures on them, but yeah, see how you can do.
Yeah, in 2 minutes or less, right? So maybe, I guess, to be as frank as I can, you know, and what I appreciate about Vijay's question is he highlights the WTO. Whoops, there's my hand. WTO and FAO, and I think step one is that relationship needs to be closer. So when I was presenting my ideas, it was the Director General of the FAO, it was the Deputy Director General of the WTO. So it is the leading, that by and large, the heads of these organizations, and myself talking about subsidies, talking about developing countries. And I found myself in between both leaders of these organizations. And I was talking about, we need to rethink what we mean by good subsidies and bad subsidies. We need a new consensus on what's a good subsidy in the trade regime. And I felt that there was consensus between the WTO and the FAO. The other consensus, and this was I think a significant moment that was different from the WTO 5-10 years ago, is more and more people with power and influence within the WTO recognize that food, and the language from the WTO was food is a moral issue. And from the FAO's perspective, they said food is a human rights issue. So we're already talking about food is not just economic. So people in the WTO, at high levels at the WTO, understand that food is existential, food is moral, food is at the core of how people define who they are. This is a change at the WTO. So, and I think with the relatively new leadership at the FAO, I'm feeling hopeful that if the FAO and the WTO form a new relationship, if developing countries continue their campaigns, they've been very powerful in organizing themselves, and if social movements find a way of connecting with all of these dynamics, there might be hope for the future.
That's great. So the next question is more about domestic food policy. I'm not sure if you're aware, the UK government has appointed Henry Dimbleby to lead on the National Food Strategy, and he published part 1 of the policy document last year. And I've been asked, it's Ella Davy Green has asked, what are your thoughts and reflections on what's been published so far?
So admittedly, I haven't had an opportunity to read that report yet. I'm aware of it, and I've been sort of loosely seeing what's going on. Kerry, do you have a sense of maybe highlights?
Yeah, well, I think the big debate at the moment is about food poverty. You know, there's been lots of discussions about emergency food relief, and I see that as a priority for what Henry Dimbleby is trying to do, and also you know, food procurement. I think that's really important, both in terms of supporting local-based food systems, but using that huge buying power of the public sector, the NHS in particular, to support healthier food systems. So I'd say at a political level, that's the big battle is moving away from the idea that it's food poverty is people's own fault, and is, you know, they just don't understand how to cook, or they're wasting their money on things they shouldn't be spending money on. I'm just hesitant. I don't want to put words into Ella's mouth where she's coming from, but yeah. I think it's a very good thing that the strategy is happening, and I think Henry's you know, doing good work on it. But you then have political battles to fight in terms of implementation.
Right. No, I mean, that's, so just, you know, listening to you and what I've read just generally, I mean, that's a promising start. And I agree, that focus on procurement. What's interesting to me, so just what I've been seeing in the debates within the UK is the debate over schools and keeping schools open over the winter holidays. That was, and then the intervention, it had to take a famous footballer. It had to take a cultural icon to step up and share his personal story. And for me, that highlighted the uphill battle in the UK. In my mind, it was so unfortunate, if not ridiculous, that it was such an obvious thing of how to feed kids. Keep the damn schools open, right? Like, that's such a simple concept. And I understand the politics and finances of all of that. But I think what that debate highlighted is the importance of schools. Again, as I mentioned, it was the UK that I had in mind when I said people are thinking, and I'm embarrassed. I have a 4-year-old, and I realized, oh, school's not just where you send your kid to learn stuff. School is where people take care of my child. This is the equivalent of it takes a village to raise a child. The village is in our schools and all of that. So imagining teachers and everyone at schools, heads of school, staff as caretakers and supporting them and imagining schools in that capacity. So then when you mix it with the environment, that it's very promising, and especially a system like the UK with a public health system, the NHS, that could transform something. So then I wonder, is the agroecological movement, how are they connecting with these ideas, right? The idea of being, which farmers, who are they going to buy from? Is it just, and it connects with, and it highlights to me, and I think more and more politicians realize this, and obviously you're one of the few that know this already, that food policy is not just about hunger, it's about rural development, it's about rural communities, and it's about poverty, obviously, but it's about what type of society do we want to be. If you change a food system, you change the entire country. That's sort of my advocacy side of things. You can have, you can't fix everything, but if you do focus and address a food system, that's one way of transforming so many other aspects of an economy, of social life, and all of that. What I've also learned from the Scottish government is that leadership can come from all sorts of different places, from local governments, from local councils, and from subnational governments. So I would be curious when I read the report, and again, as I learn the complicated world of post-Brexit politics in the UK, and I don't think I'll ever figure that one out. And then the other aspect, this is the big question mark, and you highlighted this in your opening remarks, is trade now, trade in the UK. What are the big ideas around trade? You cannot have a food policy without a clear trade policy. You just can't. You have to understand global markets. It's even if your focus is predominantly local production in local markets, you still have to have some relationship with the international. And unfortunately right now, international trade agreements aren't doing it. So if you combine the trade people with the farming people, with anti-poverty activists, for example. So again, this comes back to new relationships. So I think a conference like this, the Oxford conference, trying to bring those people together would be a way forward. Getting people who may not realize that they're doing food policy. So a trade expert who's maybe a progressive trade expert might not realize that they should be hanging out with the food folk.
That actually flows quite nicely into the next, and what I think might have to be our last question. Obviously, in all the discussions about trade policy, and particularly about a US-UK trade deal, it ended up boiling down to a whole debate about chlorinated chicken being allowed into the UK. But that is shorthand for, I think, intensive industrialised farming and perhaps and wanting to do things in an agroecological way, so the sort of battle between that. But this question is can you comment on rapidly increasing corporate influence at the UN? For example, at the FAO, where the new, DGQU, so right, is launching new partnerships with major agricultural corporations like CropLife, Syngenta. It's quite a lot of commentary on it, but I'll plough through it. Actively facilitating their access to new markets while rolling back FAO's prior support of agroecology. How can your office and other actors hold the UN itself accountable to indigenous peasant family farmers, workers, and the planet, instead of to corporations and USG pressure? And that's Marcia.
Okay, yeah, that's the big. I mean, I ask myself that every single day. Well, first of all, I think part of it is many people sort of in their everyday life don't appreciate how important things like the FAO are in their everyday life. So the idea of a UN organization sounds very removed, and then something like the FAO, people are like, oh, I don't understand, where does it fit? And it's not like you vote for the leadership of the FAO. So the politics of how we hold UN institutions accountable is kind of complicated and open. One way is sort of asking where should we be having these debates? So the FAO is one place, but then, as I mentioned, the Committee on World Food Security is another. What's happening is powerful countries are trying to delegitimize the Committee on World Food Security because civil society has a powerful voice there. So I think making sure that the CFS is the place, is the focus of people. So in people's advocacy, and what I'm trying to think sort of what national politicians can also do, because national politicians and people, that's the most direct relationship, is coming together to understand and force their governments to take certain positions in international forums. So learn about what is the British government saying at the FAO? What is the British government saying at the Committee of World Food Security? What is the British government doing about the Food Systems Summit? Holding the British government, and I'm using the British government as a shorthand because you and I are talking, but everyone hold your own national government accountable, because that's the easiest point of interaction. Ask them, what are you doing at the FAO? What is your position? And from that, you can push your national government. And if you happen to be in a powerful country, the UK, EU, the United States, China, Brazil, Argentina, you put those people in powerful countries, you can actually then change the dynamic, right? Who's your Minister of Agriculture? Who's your Minister of Trade? Right? That'll determine, that has profound spillover effects internationally. So there's two tracks. One, get involved in the international movements that are doing good work, and if you're not involved, get involved. New voices always make the movement more powerful. Get involved nationally, and then the third is unions. Unions know how these things work, and asking, well, what international organization is often missing is the International Labor Organization. Why is the ILO always on the margins, right? That's always, I'm not saying the ILO is perfect, but it highlights how labor is always pushed to the side as an issue. So what I do in my work is I always advocate, I always ask, okay, so we have all these UN organizations in this meeting, where's ILO? Why have we invited labor here?
That's good. That's given me a few pointers. I've made a note for a few questions. I think we very often look at food and farming issues very domestic focus. And then when we come to the international issues, we're talking about maybe healthcare and disease prevention and things, and we're not talking about food. So you're quite right to sort of suggest that I follow up on those questions. I think we've only got a few minutes left, so I've got one more quick question, which is from Valentina. In the UK, one of the ways that we've responded to the food poverty crisis has been by an absolutely amazing effort, it's got to be said, in terms of redistribution surplus food. But she asked, how can we prevent this dynamic from crystallising any further? Because it makes it more difficult to campaign against overproduction and to advocate for social support measurements rather than institutionalising food aid. So
yeah. Is the question sort of, how do we move away from a very overproduction mentality? Making more food is the priority by any means necessary?
Well, I suppose the argument, so Marcus Rashford, the footballer you mentioned, he's a big supporter of FareShare, which is the biggest food redistribution organisation in the UK. So all the surplus food from supermarkets and manufacturers is, well, not all of it, a tiny proportion of it actually, but that is being channeled towards the food banks and towards the food relief efforts. So you could argue that becomes, people say, well, actually it's going to a good use, so we shouldn't be campaigning against overproduction. So I think that's one part of the question. And the other part is about institutionalizing food aid. If food aid is filling the gaps, then does that let people off the hook in terms of trying to resolve the underlying issues?
Right. Okay. And I'm acutely aware that there's a hard stop at the top of the hour. So I'll have to be quick. So food aid and food banks, while they do great work and they work hard, that's not a human rights perspective. That's a charity model. And the problem with a charity model is it doesn't change the power dynamic. A charity model means we're always at the mercy of people with power and plenty. And historically and currently, charity models are how those with power control everybody else. So if the model is through overproduction, that means anyone who produces the most amount of food has the most amount of power in this system, and those that are able to produce the most amount of food tend to be the richest producers. So that's sort of the theoretical issue at hand. So in terms of institution, so how do you push against an overproduction way of thinking? is this idea of, okay, well, obviously we need to produce food, and we need to produce a bit more than we need as a backup. But what's more important is having multiple sources of food, not having just one way of doing it, one source of distribution, one type of production. You have to have what are called redundant sources of food. So when one fails, one doesn't work, some crop doesn't work, you have a backup system. So maybe you have local production, but then if that local production fails due to pests or whatever, you can switch to trade or what have you. So, you know, highlighting that charity is not human rights, highlighting that overproduction to some degree is important, but can create more problems than it's solving, especially ecologically. And that agroecology is more and more research is coming that agroecology can be done in a way where we can have enough, we have a bit of a surplus of food, but that surplus is not then to go into the charity stream, but that's just the necessity of how we need to grow. You always need a little bit more. I'll end with just sort of how I always think about how you cook, how we serve food at home. You always want your pantry to have a backup. You want, a little bit of extra pasta, a little bit of extra rice. So think of a food system to have those backup systems and not surplus as a systemic solving the problem.
I think that's a really good note on which to end. And I want to thank you for coming along in the virtual sense today, Michael. I hope that you'll keep in touch with everybody that's involved in the Oxford conference, and we'll really look forward to hearing about your work in future years in the role. But thank you again on behalf of everybody that is attended today. It's really interesting.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone and the organizers.